Good afternoon, Dickerson owners. This is Bill Toth, one of the past Commodores of the Dickerson Association, coming to you today, this presentation, via recording. Unfortunately, I have to attend the Nutcracker Ballet today while you were enjoying your afternoon at the Red Lobster. Thanks for the opportunity, Joe, and others, for allowing me to spend some time talking about my do-it-yourself Keel-cooled refrigeration project on Starry Night. What I'd like to do today is talk about why I decided to use refrigeration, then move on to talk about why I made the choices in the system that I did. For example, an evaporator versus a holding plate. Why I used a Keel cooling system that is dissipating heat out into the water, the Chesapeake Bay, in this example, via a large heatsink that was put on the outside of the boat. Then talk about the choice of 12 volt, 110, or engine belt driven energy for the compressor. And then talk a little bit more about the do-it-yourself installation and basically the learnings from that. And then also talk about the use of the system. I've used it this whole year, and it has been absolutely phenomenal. And then a quick around the cans of Keel cooling beverages, and just to summarize what I've learned from the whole experience. So hopefully that'll scratch any itch you have associated with refrigeration on a Dickerson 37. So let's get on to why on earth would I add refrigeration. First of all, my daughter reminds me that 10 years of using the boat, 5 months of the year, 3 weekends each month, and using 2 blocks and 2 bags of ice would only be about $1,800. Whereas the Frigiboat system and the miscellaneous wiring that I added indeed is somewhere around $2,500. But the real reason is one of my regular crew members, pictured on the slide, Miguel Garcia, is a semi-pro Marine chef, and he promised that if I had refrigeration, he would cook rack of lamb for us during our next sailing trip. So I'm going to hold him to that. But really, it's the convenience, the ability to leave refrigerated provisions on the boat for the whole season. In fact, what I did, basically keeping the icebox at roughly 39 degrees storage. I turned it on the weekend before the Dickerson race, and I turned it off the third weekend in November when the boat was pooled. And clearly, always having food and drink available upon arrival, and less cooler carting. So that's why I chose refrigeration. One of the key choices is how you will be removing heat from the icebox, and the typical choices are either a bin evaporator or a holding plate. As you see, I use the bin evaporator. They also have flat evaporators, but given the sizing and placing of the icebox and where I could put the evaporator, I chose the bin evaporator. For you folks with Dickerson 37s, it's roughly a 7.4 cubic foot icebox. And as I mentioned, I chose the bin evaporator because of the dimensional fit within the freezer and the fact that it has a small freezer compartment. By the way, I could leave ice or make ice in the freezer compartment, although I did not do that regularly during the summer. The other reasons, the holding plate seemed to be mismatched to my usage. That is, it wasn't going to be, cooling the holding plate down when I got to the boat and then, using it the weekend. Second of all, the holding plate sizes from many providers were mismatched to the size of the icebox from my perspective. And I also got some advice from people that had both systems, and they suggested I stay away from holding plates. The next issue is, where do you dissipate the heat that you're pulling out of the icebox? And I try to avoid as many mechanical and moving parts as possible. So using pump bay water to dissipate heat was not a good solution in my mind, nor was using cabin air. For those of you who've spent sleepless or close to sleepless nights on a boat in a 90-degree plus no wind weekend on the Chesapeake Bay, you'll understand why. And last of all, the thing that was probably the toughest for me to do is in the upper left-hand corner, and that is to drill that hole through the hull of the boat. As you see, the hole was plugged with the keel cooler that you see in the upper right-hand corner. You see what the keel cooler looks like from the outside of the boat in the lower two pictures. And I also provided a quick shot of the Dickerson 37 hull cross-section, which was a rather thick layer of fiberglass, some non-balsa foam, and then another thin layer of fiberglass on the inside of the hull. So my choice was to dissipate the heat outside of the boat into the seawater. The next choice was what source of energy to run the compressor. And I chose 12 volts DC versus 110 AC versus being engine belt driven. In reality, there is a small inverter, I believe, because the compressor really does run on 110. So a very purpose-built inverter takes a 12 volts, takes it up to 110, and runs the compressor. But the other choice was to run it from 110 all the time, thereby needing an inverter off the 12 volt source, broader than just the compressor. Again, I chose 12 volts for simplicity, and just as an indication, depending on what speed the compressor is running, it draws somewhere between 3.8 and 6.7 amps. I also chose to install a smart controller that allows me to either set the compressor speed manually or allow it to run most efficiently given the change in temperature in the box. The next issue I had was where was I going to mount the compressor. I wanted it out of the way. I wanted it somewhere where it wouldn't be damaged, and it turns out that right underneath the dish bin, outboard of the sink on my boat was a great location. As you can see in the upper two pictures, the smart controller installation, and in the lower two pictures, a view looking down after I removed the bottom of the storage bin, looking down on top of the compressor, and then likewise looking in under the sink. You can see the sink drain and the compressor sitting outboard out of the way. So it turns out that that's a pretty good location for it, at least on my boat. And then the next question is, why did I pursue the do-it-yourself installation? First of all, I became very comfortable with the level of support I was getting from Coastal Climate Control in Bowie, Maryland. Just exceptional support the whole way, from initial questions to ordering to almost overnight delivery to Virginia. Just great support there. And of course, as many of you know, I have a lot of time on my hands, and I needed something to do last spring. Not the case, but I did it anyhow. That rack of lamb is just a powerful reason to add refrigeration to the boat. So, what lessons have I learned, along with the season of enjoyment? Well, first of all, clearly the component location and interconnection is key. You only have so much length in terms of the copper refrigerant lines. Another great thing is the system is pre-charged, and as you connect the compressor to the evaporator, to the keel cooler, you don't have to worry about charging the system. It's pre-charged, and the fittings are such that they seal before they open. So that pre-charged system makes for a very easy installation. Additionally, based on the season's use, the insulation around my icebox seems to be acceptable, but not great. I notice that I do get some condensation on the top, especially at the hinged area hinged area between the two halves of my icebox lid, as well around the edges where at the moment it's just a wood-to-wood seal. Don't think I'm going to change much on that right now, but also realize that adding some extra insulation outside of the box or a thin layer of insulation inside the box might improve the performance of the and efficiency of the refrigeration. So from a use perspective, extreme simplicity. I basically, as I mentioned, turned it on at the beginning of June and turned it off when I pulled the boat from the water in November. At the dock, I kept the 110 shore power on, which kept the 12-volt batteries charged, which ran the refrigeration while I was away from the boat. I put a min-max thermometer in the icebox just to confirm that proper cooling continued while I was away. That is, I didn't have any food spoiled because, it got warm midweek, and when I got back to the boat at the end of the week, things were cool again. So that worked out pretty good. And I also made sure that there was a relatively large thermal mass, i.e. lots of beverages in the cooler, in the icebox, once it was cold, to help keep the icebox cold. So, from an installation and use perspective, it's worked out very well. And now, last but not least, kind of in summary, which I'll call around the cans of Keel cooling beverages. Why the refrigeration? I think I've mentioned it several times, that rack of lamb. I can almost taste it, and hopefully Miguel will be sailing this coming season and deliver on his promise. Second of all, minimizing both the moving parts, the dissipation of heat, and the quietness of operation. I went with KeelCooled system, and that's proven to be a good choice for me. And last, not maybe last, but one of the things is was the do-it-yourself installation difficult. I've adopted something very similar to the Chilton's, somewhere between 1 and 5 wrenches for the boat. I have a scale of between 1 and 5 winch handles, and I would put the overall installation as 3 winch handles out of 5. And also 2.5 boat units. As I mentioned, it was around $2,500 for the installation. And even with the 2.5 boat units, was it worth it? I would say absolutely. I've really, as I mentioned, kept the refrigeration on from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, and always was greeted with plenty of cold beverages and other delicacies when I got to the boat. So I hope this was helpful, and stop by Starry Night anytime for a cold beverage. However, if you do want rack of lamb, you'll need a reservation. Thanks so much.